Stipa-Caproni. Most aircraft try to be sleek. This one looked like a flying oil drum. In 1932, Italian engineer Luigi Stipa built the Stipa-Caproni, a plane whose entire fuselage was a hollowed tube with the engine and propeller mounted inside it. The idea was to use the barrel as a duct, forcing air through a narrowing channel to boost thrust, decades before anyone called this a ducted fan. It actually worked. The plane was unusually stable and, according to later wind tunnel analysis, more aerodynamically efficient than its stubby shape suggested. But it was heavy, slow, and impossible to sell as a fighter or bomber, so the Italian Air Ministry shelved it. Engineers now consider it an early ancestor of the turbojet, built roughly 15 years before jet engines became standard. It looked like a mistake and flew like a preview of the future, just too early for anyone to notice. Vought 173. Pilots who flew it said it handled less like an airplane and more like a spinning top learning to hover. That was the Vought 173, a U.S. Navy experimental aircraft first flown in 1942, built almost perfectly circular so its entire wing generated lift. Its stall speed was so low it could nearly stand still in a strong headwind, which is exactly what the Navy wanted for a fighter that could operate off tiny escort carriers. The success of the 173 led to a full combat version, the XFY Flying Flapjack, which was completed and ready to fly by 1947. Then jet engines arrived, and a propeller-driven fighter, however strange, was obsolete before it left the ground. The XFY was scrapped without ever flying. The V-173 itself survived, and now sits fully restored in a Dallas museum, still looking like nothing else built before or since. Blohm Voss BV 141. Symmetry is basically an unwritten rule of aircraft design. Nobody told Blohm Voss. The German reconnaissance plane BV 141, first flown in 1938, put the crew in a glass-walled pod stuck out to one side, while the engine and tail sat on a separate boom on the other. Designer Richard Vought built it that way so the observer would have a completely unobstructed view of the ground below, something a normal fuselage always blocked. On paper, it looked unflyable. In practice, test pilots found it more stable than the symmetric prototype it competed against, since the offset weight actually helped counter engine torque. It still lost the contract to a rival design with better factory backing, and only a few dozen were ever built for frontline use. None survive intact today. It was the more sensible of the two aircraft, and lost anyway. Convair XFY Pogo. Most fighters take off in a hurry, racing down a runway. This one took off standing straight up on its tail. The Convair XFY Pogo, tested from 1954, was built for the U.S. Navy to launch vertically off small ships with no runway at all, using a powerful turboprop and contra-rotating propellers to push it skyward like a rocket. Takeoff and forward flight worked fine. Landing did not. Pilots had to back the aircraft down out of the sky while looking over their shoulder at the ground, guessing at altitude with no reliable visual reference. Only one test pilot, Skip Coleman, ever managed the vertical landing with any consistency, and even he considered it one of the hardest maneuvers in aviation. The Navy canceled the program in 1956. The surviving prototypes are now museum pieces admired for their ambition and never flown again. Caproni CAS-60 Transaereo. 9 wings sounds like more lift. It is not the same thing as more control. The Caproni CAS-60 Transaereo, built in Italy in 1921, stacked 3 sets of triple wings onto a giant flying boat powered by 8 engines designed to carry 100 passengers across the Atlantic, an almost absurdly early attempt at commercial transoceanic flight. Its first hop over Lake Maggiore went fine. On its second test flight, in front of a crowd gathered to watch the future of air travel, the aircraft pitched up too steeply, broke apart structurally, and crashed into the lake. The pilot survived, the aircraft did not. Salvage crews stripped it for scrap, and Caproni abandoned the giant flying boat concept entirely. It took roughly another decade for anyone to seriously try transatlantic passenger flight again, this time with far fewer wings. McDonnell XF-85 Goblin. Imagine a fighter jet with no landing gear launched from inside a bomber's bomb bay while both aircraft are already in the air. That was the McDonnell XF-85 Goblin, tested by the U.S. in 1948, a stubby, egg-shaped fighter roughly 15 feet long designed to be carried by a B-36 bomber and released to fend off enemy interceptors, then recaptured mid-flight by hooking onto a trapeze lowered from the bomber. Since it never took off or landed on its own, it needed no wheels at all. The problem was turbulence. The wake behind the bomber buffeted the tiny fighter so violently that hooking the trapeze was nearly impossible. On one attempt, the Goblin's canopy shattered against the recovery bar, and the test pilot barely regained control before ditching. After only a handful of flights, none fully successful, the program was scrapped by 1949. 2 Goblins survive today, neither having ever landed the way it was designed to. Bartini Beriev VVA-14. The Soviets built an aircraft meant to take off from the sea, hover like a helicopter, and hunt American submarines. It only ever managed one of those things. The Bartini Beriev VVA-14, first flown in 1972 and designed by Robert Bartini, had twin hulls for water landings, inflatable pontoons for stability, and a planned set of lift engines meant to let it take off vertically before switching to forward flight. The lift engines were never delivered. The aircraft flew only in conventional mode, unable to demonstrate the vertical capability that justified its existence in the first place. Momentum drained out of the project after Bartini's death in 1974, and funding dried up soon after. A single surviving example now sits rusting in an open field outside Moscow, still recognizably shaped like an idea that never quite finished arriving. Antonov AN-225 Mriya. Size alone is a kind of weirdness, and this entry has more of it than anything else on the list. The Antonov AN-225 Mriya, completed in the Soviet Union in 1988, had 6 engines and a wingspan longer than a football field, built for exactly one job: carrying the Soviet Buran space shuttle piggyback to its launch site. Barely a few years later, the USSR collapsed, the Buran program was canceled, and the aircraft it was purpose-built for no longer existed. Rather than scrap it, operators repurposed the AN-225 to haul oversized commercial cargo, generators, turbine blades, disaster relief supplies, work no other aircraft could physically manage. It flew for over 30 decades, doing a job it was never designed for, and became more famous for that than for its original mission. In February 2022, it was destroyed on the ground during fighting near Kyiv. Nothing else like it exists, and nothing else like it is currently being built. Hughes H-4 Hercules, Spruce Goose. Some aircraft on this list are strange because of how they were built. This one is strange because of how briefly it worked. The Hughes H-4 Hercules, nicknamed the Spruce Goose despite being built almost entirely of birch, was completed in the U.S. in 1947 under Howard Hughes's direction. Designed during World War II as a giant transport that could move troops across the Atlantic without fear of German U-boats. It used wood instead of aluminum only because wartime metal was rationed for combat aircraft. By the time it was finished, the war it was built for had already ended 2 years earlier. Hughes personally piloted its only flight in November 1947, a straight run about a mile long, roughly 70 feet above the water, lasting under a minute. It never flew again. Adjusted for inflation, the program cost the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars for a single takeoff and landing. It remains to this day preserved in an Oregon museum, the most expensive minute in aviation history.